speaking of straight talk, joining us now, Chairman of the Readiness Subcommittee in the United States Congress, Republican, 1st District, Virginia, Rob Wittman. Dr. Wittman, good to have you with us, sir.
Good morning, John. It's great to be back with you.
Lots to talk about. Let's start with your call on keeping Washington open, basically, to work through keeping Congress open through August to get through these appropriation and spending bills rather than go on what seems like another endless recess.
Well, it is, John. This is one of those archaic practices of Congress that just doesn't make any sense to me, or I think to the public. To leave Washington for 5 weeks when we have all this work left to do, having to get these appropriations bills done, knowing how important it is to get that done so we can get this country on track, managing its budget, reducing deficits, paying down the debt eventually when we get to that point. And it's just illogical for me for us to be leaving Washington then. You see the things that need to be done. And this practice of the August recess, as it's called, is a practice of the past. It's a product of the days when members of Congress had to go home in horse and buggy when there was no air conditioning. So we've got plenty of jet aircraft where we can get people back and forth, and there's plenty of air conditioning there. So we ought to be staying in Washington to get the job done. And it just frustrates me to no end to see all the things that we need to be doing, the business of the nation, and in 5 weeks we leave. Now, I understand people want to go home and visit with constituents and do those sorts of things. That's fine, but I think that time ought to be earned. It shouldn't be taken when there's work left to be done.
Well, how do we get this done? I mean, there's a lot of it's just frustrating that we have appropriations bills on the table. What's the holdup here?
Well, the holdup is that the leadership needs to be bringing these things to the floor. Now they have brought them a number to the floor. We've done 7 so far. They've done a better job in making sure there's an open amendment process so that you can amend those bills and really make substantive reforms to them. But our job is to get all 12 of those out to get them over to the Senate. So we are 5 short. We should have been doing some the last couple of weeks. There was a snag with an amendment that was brought up about the display, how the Confederate flag should be displayed on federal properties. And to me, the issue with that is fairly simple. The Confederate flag can be displayed in historical context, and here in the 1st District where we have our Confederate battlefields, you would expect in the historical context for that to be done. That, to me, is an issue that can be taken up pretty easily. It should be something where you can find agreement on both sides, get that done, and let's move on with the business of the nation. That interior bill, which, by the way, gives us the opportunity to address issues like the overstepping of the EPA in this new Waters of the United States rule, where they want to expand that definition to cover so many areas that otherwise wouldn't be covered and require farmers, homeowners, businessmen and women to just do things that are not necessary to do in order to meet a particular agenda for certain folks within the administration. So those are elements in that appropriations bill where we can also address policy that should be addressed that aren't being addressed. And the same, we have financial services appropriations bills where we can address issues, all the challenges that are small community banks are dealing with, and that our real estate folks are dealing with Dodd-Frank. I mean, all those are important policy issues, John, that we need to be working on, need to be doing our job to counter what we see as the overstepping in this administration. Those are the things we ought to be doing. Those are meaningful things where the House can do its job in that process, and then send that over to the Senate to make sure that the Senate does its job. But we don't provide the conduit for the Senate to do their job if we don't do ours. If we don't force the issue and say, let's get those appropriations bills done, let's get to those key policy issues too that we can address through the appropriations bills, through the amendment process, then we miss the opportunities to do the things that we have to do. There's the 3 branches of government. Our role is to do that. Our role is to push back against what we see as the overstepping of the executive branch. And I hear that every day. People are frustrated. They say, Rob, what are you all doing? We see things happening from the administration. What are you all doing to address that? This is our opportunity to do that. This is what we should be doing. This August time period ought to be focused on that. And I understand, people wanting to take some time off and do some things like travel. I mean, I want to be able to get to certain places to be able to learn more about what we're doing to combat aggression of countries like Russia. But let me tell you, our job is to be here in Washington getting these things done. And John, that leads to my frustration. It leads to frustration of folks that I represent. And it's not just in the 1st District of Virginia. I think it's across the United States. People say, hey, get the job done. Get these things which we know are critical. Do your job as members of Congress, not just in the ordinary business of doing the simple things like appropriations bills, but also the policy perspectives of things that we have to do. It's our job to do that, to counter what we see and what a lot of folks see as the overstepping of this administration.
It's very frustrating, no question, and I think you're spot on. I mean, not everybody else has 5 weeks to just take off over the summer. People are trying to make ends meet. They're upset about what's going on in Washington, this overreach, as you mentioned. Congressman Wittman, you mentioned about the overreach just yesterday, the Obama administration attempting to now restrict investigative powers of inspector generals, which were put in place by Congress in, I think, 1978 maybe, so it was somewhere in the 70s, put in place by Congress in order to give inspector generals the authority to investigate agencies for wrongdoing, fraud. Now Obama's trying to restrict their power. It's just incredible.
It's unbelievable, John. The inspector generals are there as independent eyes on agencies to make sure that they are doing what they're supposed to do. And it provides transparency there. It provides oversight. It provides control on those agencies. Those agencies operate under the executive branch, but you need an independent eye to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. If you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, John, you would not worry about an inspector general looking at anything that you do. Why would the administration have any issue with making sure that their agencies are doing what they're supposed to be doing unless they are not? And if they are not, then you would say, well, we want to limit the power of the inspector generals. Again, it's the idea of government run amok, government with no controls. And we see today, John, the thing that frustrates me is we see story after story after story, day after day after day, where government's not doing what it's supposed to do, or is operating inefficiently. Or just recently, a great example is the Veterans Administration. Combat veterans automatically qualify qualify for the benefits that they receive from VA healthcare facilities automatically. But what we found was that the VA was requiring them to go through this whole process of paperwork. And in doing so, the eligibility for those benefits expired for 38,000 members. Now, that's the ridiculousness that we hear every day about the federal agencies not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that's what leads to all of us being very, very frustrated. And now if you have no control or outside look to where if those agencies aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, like this example, then how in the world do you ever bring those issues to light? How in the world does Congress do its job to make sure that we do oversight investigations of those agencies? How do we make sure that through policy and through power of the purse, we force those agencies to do what they need to be doing? Again, the idea that somehow you allow government to go uncontrolled without any oversight, like is provided by the Inspector General, is beyond me. And the examples that we see, I think, would lead you to say there needs to be more oversight, not less.
It's incredible. The level of frustration of my listeners, Congressman Wittman, I can tell you, when we see things like you just outlined, people going home in August, not getting things done, President Obama stripping away powers to investigate his own agencies with executive fiats. Now let's go to, on one hand, you got President Obama, as you mentioned, trying to strip away Inspector General's power to just shed light on what's going on. The other hand, you've got this EPA running amok in Virginia, and I know we've talked about this, but I'm trying to get this on everybody's radar screen. The EPA has a brand new set of ozone regulations that it's trying to mandate in Virginia. If these go through, it could cost our state 50,000 jobs right off the bat. Energy costs could go up 30%, devastating to low-income people or people on fixed incomes, and nobody's doing anything to stop it. Why?
Well, that's why it's important to get these appropriations bills done. That's the place where we can go in and direct the EPA as to, number one, what they're doing. Secondly is when they go through the process of adopting these regulations, we can defund that. We can say you shall not spend money on implementing these regulations when we believe that they have overstepped or when we believe they've done things that are not in the best interest of the country. And John, I spent a career as an environmental health specialist.
Right.
You won't find anybody out there any more of an advocate for our environment, but I want to make sure that we are doing thoughtful things to make sure we're protecting the environment. We want to make sure that there is a true look at the cost versus benefit. And just as you point out, when you see that the cost far exceeds the benefit, then you do have to ask yourself why. And that's Congress's job, is to ask why, and if we don't believe there's a good reason behind the why, then we have to rein those things in. That's that balance of government that people expect and that we have to do. And you see it with the EPA, you see it with other agencies. And when I go through and take a look at these regulations, and I look at the analysis that they do as to why these things need to happen and how they are applying things like the Clean Air Act, and we all want clean air. We want to make sure that we're doing everything we can. But when you look at the logic behind that and the money that's going to have to be spent, and as you said, the jobs that are going to be taken away because of that, and you look at the benefit that it creates, in many instances, John, tenuous at best associations with improvements in air quality, improvements in environmental conditions, and you have to question. You go, why are these things happening? That's our role, is to ask those questions and to provide that both that oversight, but also that control to say, no, you're going too far, and when you go too far, we're going to rein you back in, and we're going to rein you back in by saying, first of all, we're not going to provide the dollars for you to implement these regulations. We can't stop you from implementing that because they're executive branch agencies, but what we can do is we can say you will not spend money to implement these. That's our job, and that's part of our oversight role and part of our control role through the power of the purse. And those are things that we have to do, and those are the things that I think people want us to do. They want there to be a counter to an executive branch that oversteps, and we've seen times in our history when the overbranch oversteps, and Congress has stepped in to do that. I mean, going back, and this is a bipartisan issue. Go back to the days of Richard Nixon in John Schlesinger's book, The Imperial Presidency. Who countered President Nixon? Who countered him? It was the Congress. It was the Congress job that John, that did its job and countered President Nixon when he overstepped. We have the same obligation now to do that today. So people that say, "Oh, this is just a partisan issue," it's not. It's Congress's constitutional responsibility to do this, and we have to do this.
Well, it certainly was bipartisan in 1973, as you pointed out, with Richard Nixon, when the investigation, one of the toughest people on him was led by Tennessee Republican in the minority, Howard Baker at the time. Remember that?
Yes.
So, I mean, this is in our history. So you've really nailed this. We're with Congressman Rob Wittman, Republican, 1st District of Virginia. He's also chairman of the House Rural Readiness Subcommittee. Congressman, I want to go to yesterday, the House voting to cut funding off from these sanctuary cities. One other thing that just people can't understand, why we're letting these illegals out, why they just roam freely. And now we have these cities in the United States that if somebody is jailed, that the sheriffs don't even bother to tell ICE that they're illegals. I mean, this is people can't understand what is going on. Now you guys have defunded it. You only got 5 Republicans that voted the other way. What happens now?
Well, now it goes to the Senate, and I think it'll pass overwhelmingly in the Senate. So, John, we want to send that to the President's desk. if he wants to veto it, let him explain why he doesn't want cities in the United States to obey the law. I mean, that is so fundamental to this nation. I want to hear his explanation as to why he doesn't believe that the laws of this nation ought to be enforced. And they make these ridiculous statements to say, well, we're going to veto it because we want to see comprehensive immigration reform. You know, we will be sending them a bill that I believe addresses a critical issue, a critical, timely issue that needs to be signed by the president. To somehow paint this in the guise of, well, we're not going to do this unless we get all these other things that we want, is ridiculous. Another thing that we need to do, too, John, is to take up an issue about those individuals here illegally that are guilty of aggravated felonies to also serve mandatory jail time, that 5-year minimum, as they call it, Kate's Law. That's another bill that needs to be passed and needs to be sent to the president's desk to make sure that those individuals know the penalty for returning to this country, especially those that have been convicted of these violent crimes. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to say, no, we're going to let you go. And then what we see is they are attracted to these sanctuary cities because they know nothing's going to happen to them there. So can you imagine having a magnet for these violent, illegal immigrants here in the United States going to these cities? I mean, it's mind-boggling, the things that are happening, and we must act and get those things done. Get those bills to the president's desk. Let's have the national debate about why the president doesn't feel it's his obligation to enforce the law, why it's his obligation to protect the population here from violent criminals. I just don't see how he can make a rational reason or have a rational reason behind vetoing those types of bills.
Well, I think it's the right thing to do to put it up there. I want to encourage everybody, we're out of time, go to Wittman.house.gov. There you can read Congressman Wittman's statement on the Iranian deal. We're out of time. We can't cover that, but it's right on the site. Go to Wittman.house.gov. I also want to inform everybody that Congressman Wittman is considering, by my commentary, a run for governor. Just want to toss that out there. 8:30, we're out of time. I want to thank Congressman Wittman for being with us. Wittman.house.gov.